The air in my studio always smelled of potential. A sharp, hopeful scent of turpentine mixed with the earthy, rich aroma of oil paints and the clean, woody fragrance of stretched canvas. It was my sanctuary, a small third-floor walk-up where the world outside, with its noise and its demands, fell away, leaving only the sound of my brush on the canvas and the steady, rhythmic patter of Seattle rain against the large window. That afternoon, the light was a soft, forgiving gray, the kind that makes colors feel deeper, more honest. I was working on a landscape, trying to capture the specific mood of the Puget Sound just before a storm, the water a churning slate blue, the sky heavy with unspilled water. My fingers were stained with ultramarine and cadmium yellow, and a comfortable warmth radiated from the old cast-iron radiator in the corner, hissing a gentle, sleepy tune. The sharp, metallic buzz of the downstairs intercom sliced through the quiet, making me jump. I wiped my hands on an old rag, the rough cotton scratching my skin, and pressed the talk button. A muffled voice, tinny and impersonal, announced a delivery. A certified letter. My heart gave a little, unwelcome lurch. Certified letters were never good news. They were jury duty, or tax notices, or worse. I buzzed him in, the sound of the lock releasing echoing up the narrow stairwell. A few moments later, a heavy knock landed on my door. I opened it to a delivery man bundled in a rain slicker, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto my worn wooden floor. He held out a digital scanner and a crisp, white envelope. I signed with a paint-smeared finger, the cold, smooth glass of the screen a stark contrast to the warmth of my studio. The envelope he handed me felt unnervingly stiff and important in my hand. The return address was the United States Department of the Treasury. I closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. The room suddenly felt colder. The smell of turpentine seemed acrid now, not hopeful. I stood there for a long moment, just holding the envelope, the sharp corners digging into my palm. My pulse was a frantic little bird beating against my ribs. The Treasury. What on earth could the Treasury want with a 27-year-old artist who made just enough to cover rent and buy new tubes of paint? With a trembling hand, I tore it open. The paper inside was thick, official, covered in dense, blocky text that seemed to swim before my eyes. I forced myself to focus, my breath catching in my throat. The words began to resolve into horrifying shapes. Audit. Discrepancies. And then, a name I had never heard before. Evergreen Holdings, LLC. The letter stated that I, Maya Davis, was the sole proprietor and signatory of this company, and that for the last 5 years, it had processed transactions totaling just over $3.2 million. A wave of dizziness washed over me, so intense I had to grab the back of a paint-spattered chair to steady myself. The air thickened, pressing in on me, and a low hum started in my ears. $3.2 million. My name. It was impossible. A mistake. A colossal, terrifying mistake. I read the letter again, and then a third time, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. The address listed for Evergreen Holdings, LLC was a post office box in Bellevue, a wealthy suburb across the lake where my parents lived. A cold dread, sharp and metallic like the taste of blood, filled my mouth. There was only one person in my life who handled things like paperwork and finances with that kind of casual authority. The one person who always told me, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it, sweetie. I'll take care of everything." My father. The drive to my parents' house felt like moving through water. The familiar streets of my childhood looked alien, distorted through the rain-streaked windshield. Each red light felt like an accusation, each green light a push toward a confrontation I was terrified to have. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, and the car's heater, usually a comforting blast of warm air, felt suffocating, filling the small space with the scent of hot plastic and my own fear. Their house stood on a hill overlooking the lake, a modern fortress of glass and cedar that always seemed to project an aura of unassailable success. It smelled the way it always did, a carefully curated blend of my mother's expensive floral perfume, the faint, clean scent of lemon oil used on the mahogany furniture, and underneath it all, the subtle, masculine aroma of my father's study, old leather, paper, and a hint of the cigars he smoked on special occasions. I found them in the great room, a cavernous space with a 2-story wall of windows facing the churning water. My mother, Carol, was curled on a cream-colored sofa, a cashmere throw over her legs, looking at a magazine. She looked up and gave me a soft, placid smile, the kind that always made me feel like a child again. My father, Richard, stood by the window, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was a big man, not fat, but solid, with a presence that filled any room he entered. He turned, and his face broke into the broad, confident smile that had charmed business partners and disarmed rivals for 30 years. It was a smile that promised everything was, and always would be, under control. "Maya, honey, what a surprise," he boomed, his voice a familiar, comforting baritone that suddenly sent a shiver of ice down my spine. "You should have called. Your mother would have made that salmon you like." I couldn't return his smile. I couldn't even speak. I just stood there in the entryway, rain dripping from my coat onto the polished slate floor, the terrifying letter clutched in my hand, the paper now softened and wrinkled from my sweaty grip. My mother's smile faltered. "Maya, is everything all right? You look pale." My father's eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, narrowed slightly. He took in my wet coat, my wild expression, the white envelope in my hand. His smile didn't vanish, but it changed. The warmth receded, leaving behind something hard and watchful. He set his glass down on a stone coaster with a soft, definitive click. "What's that you've got there, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice still gentle, but with an undercurrent I'd never noticed before. It was the sound of a gate being slowly, carefully locked. I finally found my voice, but it came out as a ragged whisper. "I got a letter. From the Treasury." I held it out. My hand was shaking so badly the paper rattled. He didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. He just kept his eyes fixed on my face, his expression unreadable. "It's just a clerical error, I'm sure. Those government folks are always mixing things up. Let me see it. I'll make a few calls, get it all sorted out." "It's not a clerical error, Dad," I said, my voice gaining a desperate strength. "It's about a company called Evergreen Holdings. It says I'm the owner. It says I've been moving millions of dollars through it." My mother made a small, startled sound, a little gasp that she quickly stifled, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from me to my father, her eyes wide with a confusion that looked achingly genuine. My father, however, didn't flinch. He walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the faint, peaty scent of his scotch. He reached out and gently took the letter from my hand. His fingers were warm and dry against my cold, damp ones. He unfolded the wrinkled pages and scanned them, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if he were reading a slightly overpriced restaurant bill. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside and the frantic beating of my own heart. Finally, he folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the inside pocket of his blazer. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Bureaucratic nonsense. It's a simple tax shelter, Maya. A strategy. Something I set up years ago to protect the family's assets. It's perfectly legal, just a bit complicated. I used your name for simplicity's sake. It's just paperwork. You don't need to worry about it." His voice was a warm, hypnotic balm, designed to soothe and dismiss. For a crazy second, I almost believed him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to sink into the familiar comfort of his certainty, to let him pat my head and tell me everything was fine, just like he did when I was 5 and fell off my bike. But I wasn't 5 anymore. "You used my name?" I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "You opened a company in my name, without telling me? You signed my name on documents?" His hand tightened on my shoulder. His smile was gone now, replaced by a look of paternal frustration. "Maya, you're getting hysterical over nothing. You're an artist. You don't understand these things. This is the world I operate in to make sure you can have that little studio of yours, to make sure your mother and I are secure. I did it for us. For the family. For the family," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. The warmth of the house, the smell of home, the sight of my parents, it all curdled, turning into something grotesque and threatening. I looked past him, at my mother, who was watching us with a stricken expression, her face a mask of carefully constructed denial. She knew. In that moment, I saw it in the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, in the way she twisted the fringe of her cashmere throw. She knew something, and she had chosen not to see it. "I have to go," I said, shrugging off his hand. The weight of it felt wrong, a brand. I turned and walked back to the door, my movements stiff and robotic. "Maya, don't be dramatic," my father called after me, his voice sharp with command now. "We'll discuss this when you've calmed down. I'll handle it. I always do." I didn't turn around. I pulled the heavy door open, and the cold, wet wind rushed in, a welcome shock to my system. As I stepped out into the stormy twilight, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was far more than just paperwork. This was a lie, a vast and intricate deception, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The life I thought I had, the family I thought I knew, it was all a beautifully constructed illusion, and the storm had just begun. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and frantic, unfocused days. I couldn't paint. Every time I stood before a canvas, the colors seemed to mock me, too bright and cheerful for the gray, suffocating fog that had settled inside my head. The smell of my studio, once a comfort, now felt like an indulgence I didn't deserve. My father called twice a day. His voice on the voicemail was a careful mix of concerned parent and busy executive. "Maya, call me. We need to talk this through." And then, more forcefully, "This is getting ridiculous. You're letting your imagination run away with you." "I am handling it." I never picked up. I couldn't. His voice, once the sound of safety, now felt like a spider's thread, trying to pull me back into a web I was just beginning to understand. The letter from the Treasury sat on my kitchen counter, a white rectangle of poison. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, and I couldn't bear to look at it. My mind raced, replaying every conversation, every holiday, every generous check he'd ever given me for art supplies. Was that my money? Was it dirty? The questions were a relentless, pounding headache. I needed answers, but the one person who had them was the one person I couldn't trust. Then I remembered someone else. Someone who had been pushed out of the perfect family portrait years ago. My Uncle Gene, my father's younger brother. They had been partners in the family business, Davis and Son Construction, started by my grandfather. But about 10 years ago, there was a bitter falling out. The family story, the one my father told, was that Gene was reckless, a gambler who made a series of bad deals that nearly ruined the company. My father had to step in, buy him out for pennies on the dollar, as he'd said with a grim satisfaction, to save the family legacy. Gene had moved to a small town on the coast, and we hadn't seen him since. My fingers trembled as I searched for his number online. It felt like a monumental betrayal, like crossing an enemy line. But I was desperate. I found a listing for Gene's fix-it shop in a town called Port Mason. I dialed the number, my heart hammering against my ribs. A man answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly, laced with the sound of machinery in the background. "Gene's. Uncle Gene?" I asked, my voice small. There was a pause, the sound of a wrench clattering on a concrete floor. "Maya? My God, is that you?" Tears I didn't even know I was holding back sprang to my eyes. "Yeah, it's me." "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice softening. "It's been a long time, kiddo. What's up? Everything okay?" The simple, unburdened question of "everything okay" was enough to break me. I started to cry, ugly, hitching sobs that I couldn't control. I tried to explain, stumbling over the words, the Treasury, the LLC, the $3.2 million. He listened patiently, the sounds of his shop fading away as if he'd moved to a quieter room. When I finally finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy with a sorrow I could feel right through the phone. "I'm not surprised," he finally said, his voice low and full of a weary resignation. "I'm just so damn sorry he dragged you into it." "Dragged me into what?" I pleaded. "What is it, Gene?" "He says it's just a tax shelter." A harsh, bitter laugh crackled through the phone. "A tax shelter. Of course that's what he calls it. Your father is a master of language, Maya. He can make a felony sound like a business expense. Listen, I can't explain this over the phone. Can you drive down here? To Port Mason? It's about a 2-hour drive. I'll tell you everything you need to know." 2 hours later, I was pulling my car into a gravel lot in front of a low, corrugated metal building with the words "Gene's Fix-It Shop" painted in faded blue letters. The air here was different, thick with the smell of salt and low tide, a wild, damp scent that was a world away from the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood. The inside of the shop smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and hot coffee. It was cluttered but organized, a chaotic symphony of tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects. Uncle Gene stood behind a counter, wiping his hands on a greasy red rag. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was more gray than brown, and new lines were etched around his eyes, but those eyes were the same, a paler, kinder version of my father's. He was thinner, too, wiry where my father was solid, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and work-stained jeans. He came around the counter and wrapped me in a hug. It was a real hug, strong and awkward, smelling of grease and honesty. He held me for a long moment, and I felt a decade of carefully constructed family distance melt away. He poured me a mug of coffee, a dark, sludgy brew from a perpetually hot pot. It was bitter, but the warmth felt good in my shaking hands. We sat on two mismatched stools in a small, cluttered office at the back of the shop. "So," he began, leaning back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. "Evergreen Holdings. That was his new one. After I left, he needed a new place to divert things." "Divert what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Profits, kiddo. Cash. Davis and Son does a lot of work for the city, for the state. Big contracts. And on those jobs, there are always opportunities. You overorder materials, you bill for hours that were never worked. It's a classic scheme. But you can't just put that cash in the bank. The government notices stuff like that, so you need a place to wash it." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "In the old days, when it was me and him, we had a different system. But I got spooked. He was getting too greedy, taking bigger and bigger risks. I wanted out. I told him we had to stop. He told me I was weak, that I didn't have the stomach for what it took to be successful. We fought. He told me to take a buyout or he'd make sure I took the fall for all of it. So I took the buyout. It wasn't pennies on the dollar, not really. It was hush money. Enough for me to disappear and start over and keep my mouth shut. The coffee cup trembled in my hands. The story my father had told me of his reckless, gambling brother was a lie. A cover story. So he needed a new system, I said, putting the pieces together. He needed a new name. My name. Gene nodded slowly, his gaze full of pity. You were perfect. His daughter. An artist. Someone who would never look too closely at a financial statement. Someone who trusted him completely. He could open a company, sign your name, and you'd never be the wiser. He probably saw it as protecting you. In his twisted way, he probably thinks funneling millions of dollars through a shell corporation in his daughter's name is a profound act of fatherly love. It's all to provide, to build the empire, to keep the machine running. I felt a profound, soul-deep nausea. Every family vacation, every tuition payment, my first car, the down payment he gifted me for my studio lease. Where had that money really come from? My entire life felt like a crime scene I had been obliviously living in. What do I do? I asked, the question hanging in the dusty, oil-scented air. Gene sighed, a long, ragged sound. He ran a hand over his tired face. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or in your case, the $3.2 million question. If you go to him, he'll lie. He'll charm you, he'll bully you, he'll tell you you're ungrateful. He'll do anything to keep you quiet. If you go to the authorities, Maya, you have to understand what that means. You'll be blowing up your whole family. You'll go to prison. The company will be destroyed. Your mother will lose everything. They will come after you, too. Your name is on everything. You'll have to prove you knew nothing about it. He leaned forward, his kind, tired eyes locking onto mine. There is no easy way out of this. Your father built a beautiful house, but he built it over a sinkhole. And right now, you're the only one who can feel the ground starting to give way. I left his shop with a cold stone of certainty in my stomach. The 2-hour drive back to Seattle felt like a journey to a different life. The sky had cleared, and a pale, watery sun was setting over the Olympic Mountains, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and delicate pink. It was beautiful, but I couldn't feel it. The world had lost its color. I was no longer an artist admiring a sunset. I was the unwilling accomplice in a federal crime, driving toward an impossible choice. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go to the authorities first. I had to face him. I had to hear it from his own mouth. I owed the girl I used to be that much. I owed her one last, desperate attempt to see if there was any truth left in the man she had called Dad. That night, I drove back to my parents' house. This time, I didn't hesitate. I parked my car in the sweeping circular driveway and walked up the stone path, my steps echoing in the unnerving quiet of the wealthy neighborhood. The house was blazing with light, every window a warm, golden square against the deepening twilight. It looked like a picture from a magazine, a perfect image of domestic bliss and security. A perfect lie. I used my old key to let myself in. The familiar scent of home washed over me, but this time it felt cloying, the perfume of a beautiful, poisonous flower. I found my father in his study. This was his throne room, the heart of his empire. The walls were lined with dark, imposing mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal and financial texts. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. The air was warm and smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, sweet scent of a cigar he had recently smoked. He was sitting behind his enormous desk, a landscape of polished wood that had always seemed as big as a boat to me. He wasn't working. He was just sitting there, staring into the fire, the crystal glass of scotch cradled in his hands. He looked up as I entered, and his face was a mixture of relief and sternness. "Maya, good. You're finally ready to be sensible." My mother appeared in the doorway behind me, her face pale and strained. She was wringing her hands, her knuckles white. "Richard, be gentle with her," she whispered. He waved a dismissive hand at her. "It's all right, Carol. Maya and I are just going to have a talk. Close the door." She hesitated, her eyes pleading with me, and then quietly pulled the heavy oak door shut, the latch clicking with a soft, funereal thud. We were sealed in. "So," he began, his voice returning to its calm, authoritative tone. "Have you had enough of this melodrama? Are you ready to let me handle my business?" I walked closer to the desk, stopping on the other side. The firelight danced across his face, making his features seem to shift and change. One moment the loving father I remembered, the next a hard-eyed stranger. "I went to see Uncle Gene," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It was flat, cold. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine surprise, of something that looked like fear in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a flash of anger. "Gene," he spat the name like it was poison. "Of course. That bitter, failed man. What lies did he fill your head with? That I cheated him? That I'm some kind of monster?" He told me the truth, I said, my gaze unwavering. He told me about the skimming, about the cash, about needing a place to wash it. A place like Evergreen Holdings, LLC. A place with my name on it. He stared at me for a long moment, the silence broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire. The charming mask was gone. The patient, paternal facade had crumbled, and I was seeing the man underneath. The man my uncle had warned me about. He sighed a long, theatrical exhalation of breath, and leaned back in his leather chair, which groaned under his weight. He steepled his fingers under his chin. "You cannot possibly understand the pressures I am under," he said, his voice low and intense. "The world isn't some gentle, paint-by-numbers landscape, Maya. It's a war. A battle for survival. Every day, I fight to keep what your grandfather built, to grow it, to protect it. I fight for this house, for your mother's peace of mind, for your ability to sit in your little studio and play with your paints without a single worry about where your next meal is coming from." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into me. "Yes, I move money. Yes, I find creative ways to minimize our tax burden. Every successful person in this country does the same. It's the game. The government takes and takes, and it's my job, as the head of this family, to protect our resources. Everything I have done, every single decision, has been for the good of this family. For you. That's not a tax shelter, Dad," I said, my voice rising, thick with a grief so profound it felt like it was choking me. "That is a crime. It's called money laundering. And you didn't do it for me. You did it to me. You used me. You forged my signature. You made me a criminal without my knowledge or consent. Did you ever, for 1 second, think about what would happen to me if you got caught?" A dark flush crept up his neck. "I would never get caught," he said, his voice a low growl, "because I am careful, and because I expected my own daughter to have a shred of loyalty." "Loyalty?" I cried, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "You're talking to me about loyalty? You betrayed me in the most fundamental way a parent can betray a child. You put my entire future at risk, my freedom, for money. For this house. For this illusion." I gestured wildly around the opulent room, at the leather books he'd never read, the expensive art he didn't appreciate, the roaring fire that gave off no real warmth. "This illusion is your life," he roared, slamming his heavy fist on the desk. The scotch in his glass sloshed over the rim, a dark stain spreading on the polished wood. "Everything you are, everything you have, is because of this illusion. You are an ungrateful child who has no idea how the world works." "I know how it works now," I whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of me, replaced by a vast, empty coldness. "I see it perfectly." He saw the shift in me, the finality in my eyes. His strategy changed. The anger melted away, replaced by a desperate, manipulative tenderness. He stood up and came around the desk, his face softening into a mask of paternal pain. "Maya, sweetheart," he said, his voice now a wounded plea. He reached for my arms. "Don't do this. Don't throw all of this away because of some misguided, childish fit of morality. We are a family. We protect each other. I made a mistake by not telling you. I see that now. But we can fix this. Together. We'll get a lawyer. We'll sort out the paperwork. But you cannot go to anyone else. You will destroy us. You will destroy your mother. He held my arms, his grip surprisingly strong. I could smell the scotch on his breath, a sour, sweet scent. I looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of remorse, a hint of the father I had loved and idolized my entire life. But I found nothing. There was only a cold, calculating fear. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the game. I pulled my arms from his grasp. The place where he had touched me felt burned. The girl who was loyal to you, I said, my voice hollow. The one who trusted you, she doesn't exist anymore. You destroyed her when you signed her name. I turned and walked to the door. I could feel his eyes on my back, could feel the sheer force of his will trying to pull me back. My hand was on the cold, brass doorknob when his voice, stripped of all its charm and authority, cut through the air. It was the voice of a cornered animal. If you walk out that door, Maya, you are no longer my daughter. You are a stranger. You will have nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. I paused for a half a second, the threat hanging in the air. The choice was laid bare, complicity and comfort, or truth and ruin. I thought of my little studio, the honest smell of paint, the clean feeling of a blank canvas. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was real. Without looking back, I opened the door and walked out. My mother was standing in the hallway, her face a mess of tears, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. She reached out for me as I passed. Maya, please. I couldn't look at her. To look at her was to see the years of willful blindness, the quiet complicity that had allowed this to happen. I walked past her, through the grand, silent house, and out into the cold, clear night. I didn't have nothing. I had the truth, and I was about to find out exactly what it was going to cost me. The days that followed were the loneliest of my life. The act of walking out that door had severed a cord that I hadn't even realized was my lifeline. My father, true to his word, cut me off completely. My phone, which was on the family plan, was disconnected the next morning. The credit card he'd given me for emergencies was declined at the grocery store. It was a swift, brutal amputation. My mother left one tearful, pleading voicemail from a blocked number before she too fell silent, swallowed by my father's will. It was as if my entire life up to that point had been a dream, and I had just been violently shaken awake into a harsh, cold reality. I spent hours with a lawyer Uncle Gene had recommended, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. We sat in her small, spare office, which smelled of brewing coffee and old paper files. The air was thick with the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. I told her everything, my voice a monotone as I recounted the details, the words feeling like they belonged to someone else's tragic story. She listened patiently, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. Your father put you in an impossible position, Maya, she said when I had finished. Her office was quiet, the sounds of the city outside a distant, muted roar. The leather of the chair I sat in felt cool and smooth against my tense skin. Because your name is on everything, you are legally culpable. The government will assume you were a willing participant. Our job is to prove you were not. This means you will have to cooperate fully. You will have to be a witness against your own father. The words hung in the air between us. A witness against my own father. It sounded like something from a movie, not my life. But it was. The process began. It was a slow, grinding machine of depositions and interviews with men in gray suits who asked the same questions over and over, their faces impassive, their pens scratching relentlessly across notepads. I sat in sterile, windowless rooms that all smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a pale, sickly light that made my skin look sallow. I recounted my life, my relationship with my father, my blissful ignorance of all things financial. Each time I told the story, it felt like I was scraping a fresh wound. They showed me documents, dozens of them. Incorporation papers, bank statements, wire transfer authorizations. And there it was, on every single page, my signature. Or rather, a skillful imitation of it. It was my name, in a fluid, confident script that was almost but not quite mine. Seeing it repeated over and over, used to move sums of money I couldn't even comprehend, made me feel physically ill. It was a violation so profound, so intimate, it felt as though he had reached into my very identity and twisted it to his own purposes. The federal investigators were polite, but skeptical. They picked apart my story looking for holes. Why didn't I ever ask questions? Why did I trust him so completely? How could I not know that millions of dollars were flowing through an account in my name? And I had no good answers other than the simple, shameful truth. Because he was my dad, and I loved him. My world shrank to my studio apartment. I was terrified to go out. The few friends I tried to confide in couldn't understand. Their advice was well-meaning but useless. Can't you just talk to him? Work it out. They couldn't grasp the scale of the betrayal, the chasm that had opened up between me and my family. I felt like a ghost, haunting my own life. The only person I spoke to regularly was Uncle Gene. He would call every few days, his gravelly voice a small anchor in my sea of isolation. He didn't offer easy platitudes. He just listened. He told me stories about my father when they were boys, stories of a brilliant, ambitious kid who was always terrified of not measuring up to their own father's expectations. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but for the first time, I saw my father not as a monster, but as a deeply flawed and frightened man, so terrified of failure that he would burn down his own family to feel successful. The indictment came in the spring. Davis and Son Construction, Richard Davis, and, to my horror, Maya Davis, were charged with multiple counts of tax fraud and money laundering. My name in the headlines, right next to his. Sarah, my lawyer, assured me this was a procedural step, a way to pressure me, but seeing it in black and white felt like a branding. I spent that night on the floor of my studio, wrapped in a blanket, shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The smell of turpentine was gone. I had packed away all my paints. The room smelled only of dust and my own despair. The trial was set for the fall. The months leading up to it were a slow-motion nightmare. My father's lawyers, a team of high-priced, shark-like men, filed motion after motion to have the case dismissed. They painted me in the press as a disgruntled, unstable daughter, a failed artist trying to extort money from her successful father. They leaked details of my bohemian lifestyle, trying to make me seem unreliable, untrustworthy. Every day felt like a fresh assault. Finally, the day came when I had to take the stand. The courtroom was a cavern of dark wood and stifling formality. The air was thick and still, smelling of floor polish and nervous sweat. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of papers and the low, dry coughs of the spectators. I walked to the witness stand, my legs feeling like they were made of wood. I didn't look at my father, who was sitting at the defense table next to his lawyers, but I could feel his gaze on me, a physical weight. I raised my right hand, the skin feeling tight and foreign, and swore the oath. My voice was a thin, reedy sound in the cavernous room. And then for hours I answered questions. First from the prosecutor, a sharp, focused woman who guided me through my story with a calm professionalism. Then came the cross-examination. My father's lead attorney was a man with silver hair and a voice as smooth and cold as river stones. He approached me with a pitying smile, as if I were a confused child. He twisted my words, reframed my memories. He brought up every gift my father had ever given me, every check, every vacation. "Miss Davis," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "are you telling this court that you enjoyed the benefits of your father's wealth? You lived a life of privilege funded by his hard work, but you never once bothered to ask where the money came from? Does that sound like the behavior of a responsible adult or a spoiled child?" Every question was a new cut. He was trying to paint me as either a liar or an idiot. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I gripped the wooden rail of the witness box, my knuckles white, and forced myself to meet his gaze. "I didn't ask," I said, my voice shaking but clear, "because I had no reason to believe that the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who held me when I was sick, was capable of committing a federal crime and using his own daughter as a shield. I didn't ask because I trusted him. That was my mistake. But it is not my crime." My eyes flickered, against my will, to the defense table. My father was staring at his hands, his face ashen. In that moment, he looked old and defeated. The powerful, invincible patriarch was gone, replaced by a gray-faced old man in an expensive, ill-fitting suit. Across the aisle, I saw my mother sitting in the front row. She was weeping silently into a handkerchief, her shoulders shaking. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in her gaze I saw a universe of pain, regret, and a terrible, devastating love. She was a victim, too, in her own way. A prisoner in a gilded cage he had built for both of them. The trial lasted for 2 more weeks. I felt hollowed out, a spectator to the public dismantling of my own family. When the jury finally came back, the tension in the courtroom was so thick I could barely breathe. I sat with my lawyer, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. The foreman, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled shirt, stood and cleared his throat. He wouldn't look at my father. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering," he said, his voice flat and emotionless, We the jury find the defendant, Richard Davis, guilty. A strangled sob escaped my mother's lips. The words continued, a drumbeat of guilty, 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 for each of the charges. My father didn't react. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if he were watching a play about someone else. As for the charges against me, the jury found me not guilty, accepting that I was an unwitting pawn in his scheme. A wave of relief, so profound it left me dizzy, washed over me. I was free, but there was no joy in it. The sound of my mother's crying was the only victory music I would hear. As they led my father away, he finally looked at me. His face was a blank mask, his eyes empty. There was no anger, no hatred, no love, no regret. There was nothing. He had already erased me. I was a stranger. Months turned into a year. My father was sentenced to 7 years in a federal, minimum security prison. The family company was dismantled, its assets seized by the government to pay a mountain of fines and back taxes. My mother sold the big house on the hill and moved into a small, quiet condo, her life of effortless luxury vanishing overnight. We didn't speak. The gulf between us was too wide, filled with the wreckage of the trial and the words we could never take back. I was left with the rubble of my former life. I was legally exonerated, but the stain remained. My name was still linked to his in the public's mind. I sold my studio. The memories there were too painful. For a long time, I couldn't paint. The desire, the spark, was just gone. I took a job at a coffee shop, the anonymous, repetitive work a kind of comfort. The smell of roasting beans and steamed milk replaced the scent of turpentine. I learned to make perfect foam hearts on lattes for strangers, and in those small, fleeting moments of creation, I found a sliver of peace. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild. I found a new, smaller apartment in a different part of the city. I started seeing a therapist who helped me unpack the complex knot of grief, anger, and betrayal. It was hard, painful work. Some days, the weight of what I had lost was crushing. I had lost my family, my home, my name, and the entire narrative of my life. One rainy afternoon, about 2 years after the trial, Uncle Gene came to visit. He brought me a housewarming gift, a large, brand-new, stretched canvas, and a full set of professional-grade oil paints. I thought it was about time, he said, his kind, wrinkled eyes smiling at me. I looked at the blank, white canvas. It wasn't intimidating. It was a promise. It was a space that hadn't been touched by lies or deceit. It was a beginning. That night, for the first time in years, I squeezed tubes of paint onto a palette. The rich, familiar smell filled my small apartment. I picked up a brush, the worn wooden handle feeling like a long-lost friend in my hand. I didn't know what I was going to paint. I had no grand vision. I just put the brush to the canvas and made a mark. A bold, angry slash of crimson, then a deep, sorrowful stroke of blue. I painted for hours, losing track of time. I wasn't painting a landscape or a portrait. I was painting feelings. The chaos, the pain, the loneliness, the flicker of hope. I was telling my own story, in my own language, with no one else's name attached. My life is quiet now. It is small, but it is real, and it is mine. I am an artist again. My work is different, darker, more complex, but more honest than anything I ever painted before. I sometimes get letters from my mother, short, hesitant notes filled with news about the weather and questions about my health. They are the careful, tentative letters of a stranger trying to build a bridge over a ruin. I write back just as carefully. Maybe one day, that bridge will be strong enough to walk on. I have never heard from my father. I don't know if I ever will. The man I loved is gone, and the man in prison is someone I don't know. The betrayal he committed was a kind of death, and I have had to learn how to mourn him and move on. There is a scar on my heart where my family used to be, a place that will always ache when the wind blows a certain way. But I survived. I found my own name again, and I am learning, one brushstroke at a time, how to sign it with my own hand.